Oh.
Right, shush, thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name's Ishmael. I'm here to talk about the whiplash raid of 1994 and its repercussions and aftermath. And anyone who's old enough will know what I mean when I say, like, I feel like Ronnie Corbett sitting in this chair. Right, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Right, nobody else does, that's fine. By 1993, the scene had existed as we know it for 10 years.
It was a little too top down.
It's like working with Basil Brush. And at the beginning of 1993, a new club opened called Club Whiplash. To explain the dynamic, up until then, there'd been 4 clubs. The serious one, the quirky one, the big dancey PVC disco one, and the weird one. The weird one was TG. The disco one was Submission. The quirky one was Severin's Kiss, and the serious one had been called De Putsch. After 10 years and more than 200 events, this closed in October 1982. 92. Whiplash stepped into the evolutionary gap. It was run by a man called Robin Adams and another man called Nick Overend. Robin was the money, the man who did the work, the man who got the opportunities and the connections in Clubland. Nick, my very good friend, was the man on the scene who had the connections to make it talked about, to make people turn up with their big boots on and their whips to have a good time in what was generally a gay venue called Reflex in Putney. The venue had previously been used by Tim Woodward for a number of Skin 2 parties. You may have had the experience of turning up somewhere that you last left when you were drunk, going, "Oh, it's here!" because it's changed its name in the meantime. Whiplash was a huge success. It thoroughly lived up to its name. It was a real breath of fresh air from the actually quite restrictive, paranoid environment that had been on the scene before. A lot of people who wanted to contribute suddenly found there was a stage they could contribute on, and that was the reason it went so well. After 18 months, the club had started to draw attention that it hadn't been intending to invite. We get to the night of October the 12th. There are times you'll have recognised them. You look back and think, there was a lot of shit going down there. It's like, that was mental. It was just one of those times when everything, this is for me, everything was coming in at the same time. I'd just finished shooting a half-hour movie for the Muir Academy. For those who don't know, they do grown-up school still. My ex-girlfriend had been on the phone saying, "Oh my God, my mum's died." I'd just done Kilroy, which, again, for those of you who are lucky enough not to know, was an early morning talk show with the orange-skinned Robert Kilroy Silk. And they were doing it about whether SM's okay or not. I did it that morning. Then we finished shooting the movie in Croydon before packing all the camera gear into the boot of a lady called Sheila's car. Bloody hell, she could hit hard. Of blessed memory. And she gave me a lift up to Putney for whiplash. So, took the gear in. Somebody says, "Here, Ishmael, what's this lot?" I said, "Well, just can I put it somewhere?" Okay, this was the manager, who I hadn't really clocked before. Turned out it was called Martin. He becomes very, very important as this goes on. Says, "Stash it in the dressing room." Okay, thanks. Really thanks. Thinking, I'm on a wing and a prayer here. I know I'm on a wing and a prayer. So, stashed it in the dressing room. Set my stall out. I was a stall holder in those days. And I knew what was coming. It was the ex-girlfriend coming down to kind of cry on my shoulder about her recent bereavement. And what else could I do? Come 9:30 when she arrives, I know I'm also on a promise. So I was thinking, 2 o'clock, she's going to be gone. So the evening went on, another beer, and another beer. And ex-girlfriend left, along with friend who worked for the CPS, who seemed to have his own personal force shield, as became apparent, because as they were leaving, I was told this later, as they were walking up the steps of Reflex, 60 police were walking down them. The lights all came on. Suddenly, the music had stopped. It wasn't a happy, kinky SM party anymore. Suddenly, it was a police raid. There were 60 policemen. If you just count the number of people in this room, we've got, about 30? If you add 6 people in police uniforms, that makes a real change to the dynamic. Suddenly, we all start looking around and going, shit! We can't help it because they're all big and they know what they're doing and they look alike and they can talk to each other on radios. So everybody's standing there wearing their rubber leather and PVC going, what the fuck's going on here? And right in the middle of this, and this is like police in the strident yellow bile-coloured jackets, and none of them look friendly. And some of them have got dogs, and there's some plain clothes, and there's a couple of people who are from the CPS. This is serious shit. This is big. I didn't realise quite how big at the time, but 60 police costs money. Right in the middle of this, conducting this dance macabre, is the man in charge. This is Chief Inspector James Madden, in his brown Chief Inspector gloves. They all had them in those days. It's how you could tell. And we're all standing looking at these police and they're looking back at us. None of them are taking names and addresses because they didn't do that. This is a myth. They never prosecute the people who are the recipients of the service. They prosecute the providers. Cynthia Payne, they never went for the gentleman, they went for Cynthia. So, we're watching all this going on. One little bit that we didn't notice was this little lady called Nettie Pollard. Only about 5'4", slight, precise, with her glasses. And she walks up to, walks up to Chief Inspector Madden. Says, "Excuse me, could I have your name, rank, and number, please?" And he says, "Yes, I'm Chief Inspector James Madden, and this is my number." She says, "Thank you very much. And who are you?" Says, "I'm Nettie Pollard. I'm from the National Council for Civil Liberties, and you'll be hearing from me." And off she went. And then I personally realised I'd got a problem because all my camera gear was in the dressing room.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So while everybody in a state of oh shit, I was walking around looking dressing room door. Two of the most enormous constables I've ever seen have stood in front of it, like Gog and Magog. And I went to find the most friendly-looking sergeant I possibly could do, and said, "Look, this is the situation. Camera gear, not my camera gear, not my property. If it's not in Macclesfield tomorrow, my friend is going to be in really deep doo-doo. If you look at it, if you go through it all and find it's got absolutely nothing that's germane to what's going on, can I have it, please?" "All right, sir." So this is what we do. And he goes through it all. He says, "Right, camera box. Oh, VCR tape. You can't have that. It's Doctor Who and the Daleks. You don't want that." "Well, I have to keep it, sir." It wasn't. It was the footage from the film that we got a copy of, but I never heard anything more about it, so I'm all right. And then I walked out with this, and Derek holding the rest of it behind me, walking up Putney High Street, knowing that in the camera box there was this thing that looked like an audio cassette, which was what he thought it was, and it wasn't. It was 9mm video. And it was everything we got over the last 3 days that we were never going to be able to get again because circumstances didn't work like that. And I've never been so relieved in my life. About a week later, on the Saturday night, I invited everybody who'd been involved in my little film down to my flat in Stamford Hill to watch the rushes. And they were all seeing people. So apart from going, "Oh, outtake, one for the mistakes reel," it was, what the hell's been going on? Because it wasn't just that raid. Robin and Nick had 3 separate enterprises going. Whiplash, we know about that. Whiplash Pleasure Zone and Whiplash North. The Pleasure Zone had been down in a sports club in Kingston. It's closed now. I'd been there, this was within the month. And front of house had been issued with radios because there'd been a warning. The police are going to come in. When you get the word, close play down. Right. What we didn't know was that some newspaper were coming in as well.
Oh gosh, no.
I got whipped by a Sun journalist. She was actually quite good. She had promise. I didn't know she was a Sun journalist until I saw it in the Sun. I didn't buy it. The following Monday, and there it was. This is our undercover reporter who went in and got all of the sleazy details about these wicked perverts. And there were pools of blood under the cross. There were. We saw them. I phoned them up and said, "These pools of blood." "Well, they were there. Not under that cross. There was another cross." There was only one cross. Anyway, and Whiplash North. North got just closed down very quickly and very quietly by Wood Green Police. So we were told. They'd gone in, said to the owners of the venue, "No more Whiplash North." The owner of the venue and his wife have now passed away, so there's no way of checking this, or I would. So there was this massive, this hadn't happened before on the scene. Now, for a club to get a police visit, yeah, sure. David Claridge had to stop his operations at Club Maitresse when the press got a bit too close to the fact that he was also Roland Rat. But nothing on this scale. So there was for a lot of people, there was an immediate, oh my God, what's going to happen now? Who's going to be next? A lot of promoters were going, whew, are we okay? What was really going on there? And wanting to know from promoter to promoter, what's the story? And where's it going to go now? For most of your pervs on the street, certainly those who've been in the club whiplash clientele, the obvious place to attend, to move to, was the gate, which had just opened. And the gate's admission policy was far more careful at that time, at the beginning, than club whiplashes have been. Whiplash had said, right, everybody, if you're into it, come and play. The gate was much more, if you're into it and we know you and you can be sure, we're absolutely sure about you and we know you're not a journalist or a member of the police force or you ex-shoppers, then, okay. And please, couples only at the moment. That's why I didn't get to go to the first one. However, there was also the question of where is this going to go legally? Now, the law that they were prosecuted under has changed. Tony Blair repealed it. It was the Disorderly House Act. Yeah, I know. It was a piece of 18th century legislation which was brought in to underpin the Brothel-Keeping Laws. Are we all aware of how the Brothel-Keeping Laws work? Okay, right. If you've got, I used to work in this part of the sex industry, so I remember. If you've got a woman working who is the provider of sex, it is okay to have another woman on the premises to answer the phone and the door. That's called the girl and the maid. If you've got two girls, it's a brothel. If the maid sells any sex, it's a brothel. So that's the shape you can have it, and no other, because that turns it into a brothel. If, however, there's no money changing hands, that's where the Disorderly House Act cuts in. Cut in, doesn't anymore, it's gone. And the way the Disorderly House Act worked was it was illegal to have a lewd display on the same premises on a regular basis. This means the police had to observe the activities at the Reflex Club for 3 months running, because that's regular. Once is once, twice is twice, 3 times is regular. And it has to be lewd on all these occasions. This isn't the best drafted law ever. I can imagine somebody in a Henry, what's his name? 18th century satirist, can't remember, wrote Tom Jones. Writing all this down just as a piece of satire. Some priapic 18th century justice going, I know how he can get Mrs. Slipslop for her disorderly house. I shall write a law. And the law's crap. And what it meant was that the police had to prove that what had been going on for 3 months on 3 occasions regularly had been lewd. They had to convince a jury that it was lewd on every single occasion, and that the defendants, I haven't got to this, the 2 people who'd been charged were Robin Adams, the promoter, and Martin Church, the manager, he who showed me to the dressing room, were both responsible, because otherwise the charge wouldn't stick. Because just charging the whole of the SM scene, saying you were all being lewd, was never going to work. They had to charge an individual. That's the way it operates. And what they had hoped was that Mr. Adams and Mr. Church were going to lob a guilty plea. And they didn't. They fought back. They said, no, not guilty. Prove it. I don't think the police had also anticipated that any of the good, upstanding, outwardly respectable middle-class citizens they intimidated at Putney on the 12th of October 1994 were going to go, no, bollocks to this. We're not going to run away back into the closet. We're going to stand in the witness box and say, no, it wasn't lewd. But what's in those police statements, which all agree with each other, are not true things. They're porkies. The police are making it up. It didn't happen like that. Mr. Adams's case got thrown out at the second hearing. I was there. It was at Bow Magistrates Court. The Stokenjury magistrate could not find evidence that the police provided that Mr. Adams had been running the event or had been responsible for the lewdness, if there was any, on all 3 occasions. So then the law didn't apply. They couldn't convict him. Then it was up to Mr. Church. Mr. Church, as far as I know, was not, if he's still alive, is not an SMer. He didn't have anything apart from doing the right thing to gain by throwing in a not guilty. He could have said, okay, I've done it. I'll put my hands up. I'll take a whatever reductions I can have. I'll say I did it. It was me. But he didn't. He said, no, not guilty. Prove it. So we had the trial. It was at Southwark Crown Court. And the police lost. I'm not aware that there's been another attempt like this to scare the scene back into the closet, because to my reading, that's pretty much exactly what it was. It was, right, you've had your 10 years of fun, now it's all got to stop. It hasn't stopped. And it didn't stop because of the amount of fuss that was created over that trial, because it wasn't just that we stood up to them in court. There were people writing to MPs, there were people marching through the streets of London, also to do with the Spanner. It also tied in with Countdown on Spanner, which was the campaign group at the time connected with the Spanner case. That's another story. There were protests outside Putney railway station saying, look at the amount of money, it was £500,000, that has been wasted trying to get this prosecution. Because 60 police don't come cheap. You need to be pulling in some pretty hefty muscle to get 60 cops in one place at a time. Nowadays, even more so. I spoke to a couple of friends who were on the inside working with the CPS. One of them said, no, there was definitely not this meeting that you're talking about where the CPS said to the police, do not under any circumstances try and pull this off again unless you've got photographic evidence, which you can only get by consent of the management and the promoter, otherwise it's entrapment. No, never do this again. That meeting did not take place and I was not there.
Honest truth.
That's the way he phrased it. You can witness the fact there hasn't been anything like that since. As to why Club Whiplash had been hammered quite so extensively as it was, this has bothered me for a long time. And I've looked and I've thought, well, surely it must have been one agency behind this. Who on earth could have had it in for him to that extent? And not so very long ago, I spoke to Robin Adams again for the first time in about 20 odd years. He's still with us, thank goodness. He's living in a retirement property somewhere in southeast London. And he said, well, I don't know about Whiplash North. That, I'm afraid, is going to remain a mystery for time immemorial now. He said about the pleasure zone, that was down to the son. They'd phoned me up. They said, we know there's a Labour MP on your books. You tell him who we are, we'll leave you alone. He wouldn't tell them, so they raided his pleasure zone. He was never able to use that venue again. So it was a shame, it was a good venue. And as to the Whiplash raid, he said, well, you know who the MP was? David Mellor. I said, really? He said, yeah. Yes, I said, of course he was. He lost in 97. I was at the count in Ali Pally. I remember the cheers. He says, yeah, it was him. I said, how do you know? He says, oh, well, you know, he used to send printers as me. Really? He said, yeah, well, he was telling them one time. He said, he got this police inspector who was, he was a born-again Christian. He says, he said, you've got to get me out because he was embarrassed we got our club on his patch. So that's how it all happened. I said, is that true, Robin? He says, yeah. So that's what Robin told me. As to the lady from the CP, not the CPS, the National Council for Civil Liberties, this happy little end to the story is from the trial when she was about to take the stand. And the judge said, oh, I should possibly remind the jury, Ms. Pollard, that as a member of the National Council for Civil Liberties, your testimony could be taken as that of an expert witness.
Oh.
The lesson, I believe, of this, ladies and gentlemen, is that if anyone tries to take away the freedoms that we have on the scene, if anyone says you must not express love in that way because we say so, the way to respond is to tell them to fuck off. Not to kowtow, not to say, we will obey you. Stand up to them.
Except the bill that's going through at the moment, which defines a lot of what we do as abuse against the law.
Stand up to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm not disagreeing, I'm just mentioning that.
Right, well, thank you for mentioning that. These things have to be stood up to because the horrid people who don't like us haven't gone away.
Sorry, what is the gist of this bill? I'm uninformed here.
Is it the coercive behaviours?
Yes, it's domestic abuse bill that's going through at the moment. Has various clauses including coercive behaviour that are going to affect us.
I'll be arrested.
There's been objections gone into the House, but the bill has major support on both sides of the House.
There are some stuff on the bill that's how I'm a serious victim, but I do understand that there's some of it that's very out there. Yeah.
Sorry, I haven't meant to.
No, that's it. I think I've run out of words. I don't got no idea if we've got any more time. If anyone wants to ask me anything, please do.
Yeah, so, sorry.
When does that bill come into?
I think it's its second reading stage, so probably 2 years. I'm not an expert on that, it's just a while since I read it, and wrote MPs and so on. So I'm not an expert, but it's worth checking out.
I don't know very much about it. My only thing I can add is that love laughs at locksmiths, and that's one of the things we found with the Disorderly House Act was that it was stood up against and right did win, so keep fighting.
Right won because of the bravery of the people who went to court.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Brave is always good.
So you described events from, I think you said 1993.
Four.
That have occurred against the legal landscape that existed then. Has that legal landscape evolved today significantly, or are we still at peril in the same way theoretically?
I believe it has moved, but the difficulty with tracking it that I found, and I've not been that involved the last 10 years or so, is that changes tend not to be made in a way that they will make the pages of the moralistic press, because that will cause a backlash. So, for instance, when the change in the law over where the police would prosecute for over assault under Spanner, Regina versus Brown, there was a change, but it was in the threshold at which the police would take action, not in where, at what point you could consent to assault on oneself, because the latter would have raised the hackles of the moral majority and would have been something for people to jump up and down and be cross about, whether there was the first one, which was what they did, because they slipped under the mat, which is what they did.
Well, they can always find a law to prosecute. What we do is illegal. Simple as that. If you've got a bruise that lasts 24 hours, that's occasional actually bodily harm.
To answer part of your question, we would like to think that the UK is one authority and you would get the same treatment all over the place. There are parts of this country that cannot have fetish events. So over across in Manchester, there is a venue that I use on a regular basis. They are a police hate crime reporting centre. There is not an equivalent one in Nottingham, because the Nottingham Constabulary have shut everything down that they can find out about. So you get this situation where one lot, quite happy with it, understand, found ways of working with it. You then get a far-right Christian fundamentalist head of the police, and the whole thing just goes completely the other way around. So it's a shame that it should be uniform. It's not. So if you end up in the wrong jurisdiction with a police officer who's up for beating the moral drum, you'll get a lot more hassle than you would in a big city.
Yeah, and against that context, I mean, my impression over the last 20, 30 years is that there's been a period of relative moral tolerance, which seems to be coming to something of an end in the current era. We seem to be becoming more moralistic and more puritanical than we have been for a long time. When you care to comment?
I would have, having had my own police visit first thing in the morning one time, human trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, that they then 3.5 months later said, oh, false allegation, don't be sorry, you can have your shit back a couple of days before Christmas. I agree that there are aspects of it that just don't understand this. So the team that came in, the specialist human trafficking team, it's quite clear when you've got a big arrow on the wall that says dungeon this way, you're not farming people out to pick cockles in Morecambe Bay. Yeah. So
Unless they want to.
we were on completely different pages to each other. I'm like consensual kink SM kind of, that's my kind of slavery, and they're all knocking shops. And shockingly enough, when I said, look, I mean, you're wasting so much time and money here today, do you not think you could just go around the corner and do over the nail bar at the same time? Yeah. But nail bars aren't, and I'm like, come on, seriously.
So we use slavery as a vocabulary in a completely different sense. I mean, it's
Exactly.
the same word, but it's not the same meaning.
So they had their definition that they were hammering home, and yeah, my definition wasn't even in the same book.
A lot of the themes that you spoke about were in Preaching to the Converted.
Yes, I was in it too.
Oh, were you?
Yes, I'm in one shot in profile in the orgy.
Because especially like politically, with a lot of the ranting and stuff that was going on, like, is is this around the same kind of time?
Yeah, Preaching was filmed in '96.
So very close.
Preaching was more influenced by the Spanner case,
Okay.
which was Regina versus Brown, which, since you're taking notes, I presume you know about.
No, I'm just taking notes. To
Okay, I'll tell
be
you.
able to
I'll tell you
focus.
afterwards, or next time if you read books.
I was given great advice at one event that if the police ever raid an event as a top or person administering things, shut up, step away, and let the person that's had it administered to them do the talking. Otherwise, it can be
Yes, stroke no. They haven't pushed anyone for aiding and abetting your own assault, so the subs would often get charged with that. But certainly in the last 15 years, I've had to deal with cases where someone went to the doctors, cane marks on their arse, the doctor reports it, social services get involved. They then put the pressure on the sub to, if you don't say who did this, then we'll prosecute you for aiding and abetting your own assault. So,
So the official caution is that you are allowed to keep silence. If anything you say, if anything you say or do not say will be used in court, and but you are allowed to have legal protection. So the best thing to do is just to be very, very polite, and if anything, law yourself up and get legal protection right away.
and don't take the duty solicitor. Okay. The duty solicitor is about running numbers.
If it's a public event, shout across the dungeon, how many lawyers have we got? Seriously, there's 5 on my local scene.
Sorry, your hand's been up for ages.
Yeah, so my question was, how do we solve this issue of people coming down on the kink scene? Is it a good thing that kink is illegal, or should it be legal? If it is legal, are there any problems that are raised with that?
Fuck, that's a big question.
So there is the Human Rights Act, which is 1998, which say that in one of the sections it say that you have the right to exercise or kind of wherever
Right to a private life.
in your private life, which is in public scene. Obviously, that doesn't apply. However, there are in the Human Rights Act 9 protected traits, which range from sex, gender, sexuality, transgenderism, religion, race, etc. But kink play is not one of the protected traits, which is
It could be argued that
it could be argued that it is, but
And I've actually paid the bill to find the answer out to that one. It cost us £4,500
really,
to get Rabinda Singh to spend about 2 hours telling us that actually we had a case to go forward. But at the time when we were looking to do a High Court appeal against this, there was just no stomach within the legal structure for that kind of moral.
cases.
We've been looking for. So I work with the Spanner Trust. I'm the chairman, and for years we've been constantly looking for people who are in a position to fight and challenge some of this. But with the changes to legal aid, it used to be, all we needed to do was find someone who was on benefits who this affected, and we could try. That's all been swept through. So we've got a war chest to fight, but it's not high enough to fight a High Court appeal, which is going to be £250,000.
Especially if they want to get rid of the Human Rights Act as well.
And I mean, this is kind of perfect storm scenario, because Brexit means that we're now in dubious ground on the human rights. They're very, very keen on being sloppy with that legislation. And for about the last 6 years, where every piece of legislation that comes forward is supposed to have a public consultation, so, hey, who are the appropriate authorities to talk about this? There's not been one. So even the acts that have been specifically coming forward that mention kink in them, the government is supposed to consult with the Spanner Trust I think it's the last, because it used to be Spanner Trust and SM Pride. SM Pride fell to pieces, so they're no longer consulted. So the last organisation we have that can legally consult with the Home Office is the Spanner Trust.
What about backlash?
No, it's not legally formed. It used to be, because the secretary of Backlash used to be me. But and it was on the grounds that I was the one that didn't ever need to spend any money, so I was safe looking after the purse. But when it all got a little bit dubious, I stepped back, and there is no backlash, and that's the shocker. So without having an entity and a structure, you have no responsibility, or the government have no responsibility to talk to you. It's why Lamb is a limited company, because if they come after us, I'm going after them for living on immoral earnings. And that's been the deal since day one. We're totally legit on board, because if they do come after us, we then have, since March 2006, we can do them for everything they've taken off me. And that's
Do you remember Helen Buckingham? 80s.
no.
Taxman went after her for her earnings as a prostitute stroke dominatrix. Because she tried to offset her expenses, her leather gear, her whips and everything else, against her income. She was paying tax perfectly happily. When it went to court, she threatened to prosecute the government for living off immoral earnings. The case was dropped. She formed the first prostitutes union in the UK. I think that was about 82, 83.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
What was her name?
Helen Buckingham. I can't remember if that is working name or real name.
I mean, a lot of it is based on the intimidation that who's going to fight that legislation. So the first one I fought was Extreme Pornography Bill 2008. There were 127 mentions of paedophilia in the legislation. Now that was entirely there so that anyone who was going to stand up and object to that, they could turn around and say, you're defending the paedophiles. And they're like, no, we're not. Your preamble to the documentation has 127 mentions. The legislation has none, because it wasn't relevant to that particular piece of legislation, because there's already good legislation on the books to prosecute paedophiles because it's an abhorrent crime. So the attempt to conflate the two is often done to, well, decent people aren't going to defend the rights of that sort of person, are they? So it's sloppy legislation is the way I refer to it.
No, it's not. It's legislation designed to be as flexible as possible for the government to use as it wishes.
Yes.
There's nothing sloppy about it.
Oh, no.
It's beautifully constructed if you're in England.
Yes. But in terms of how the law is supposed to work, it's sloppy.
Yes.
I mean, British law is literally built on the fact that everything is done within reason and necessary. So it's like, it's literally as flexible as they want it.
No, British law works on the opinion of the judge who hears the case.
Yeah, very much.
The first time that law goes.
Yeah.
Would you say though that the lens moved away from the scene because it got more fixated on sex work?
I don't think legislation or government focus has ever differentiated as far as they're concerned. Right, in my patch, there are two main venues. One is run by a pro-dom who is a sex worker. The other venue, in common with lots of areas, is a swingers club. Now, I know that the owner has a hard line about sex workers working in her swingers club, but there are at least a couple of people who attend who are sex workers in their own right. Anytime the police want to go have a go,
well, I just want to say, if people are interested about the domestic abuse bill that's being passed up Parliament, you can definitely read online. But I understand how dry a piece of legislation can be to read. There's a set of videos done by TLDR News on YouTube that I think is really good, and they break down into some really the key facts of the legislation, and basically it's designed to give domestic abuse victims more power, more protection, etc. in court. But obviously, as we have said, British law is very flexible. That's to affect some other subset that doesn't.
Oh, there are some extra provisions in the Act.
Oh, sorry.
So in regards to everything that we've spoken about, and obviously the issues that are coming to light, do you think that this is something that needs to be tackled early on, something needs to be happening now to combat this so that we can protect our livelihood?
I think there's always a case that you need to be vigilant when you know there are people that hate you. We have, certainly in Rupert Murdoch, a newspaper owner who hates us and hates the country we live in. But, oh yeah, for goodness sakes. And you can't appease malice. You can't say, okay, we'll be nice to you and you'll be nice to us. We won't. There is always that. There is always somebody there who wants to be able to frighten everybody by saying, you're a pervert and I can make your neighbours attack you.
Yeah. That's
the bottom line. And you always have to keep an eye on that, because it's like if one of your neighbours has got a mad psycho dog down the street, you don't walk past the gate drenching yourself with aniseed and singing "I hate dogs" at the top of your voice. You've got to keep an eye on that. You've got to be aware, because if something moves, if he starts gearing up to go for one of us, if he attacks a lady in Southend for being a proton, that's an attack on all of us. This is John Donne saying no man is an island. We're not. There's a great notion, and it's come out of a lot in the last 5 years about Brexit, about, oh no, we're all individuals, we're all just one person, we're all just families. This is bullshit. We have to be a community. We have to look out for each other. So that's why groups like Countdown on Spanner and Backlash were so important. If anybody wants to restart Spanner or SM Pride, I'm still the honorary president of SM Pride. They didn't take that off me.
Yeah. I always wondered you had that, because they got
That's me. No, it was me. I've got it. Slemmings was stupid enough to give it to me, and I hung on to it.
That's not right. The other one that Deb's touched on earlier, the BDSM defence in strangulation cases. The media reaction to that is all kink is evil.
Yeah, well, that's going to be the thing with, certainly at some level of journalism, it's always going to be, let's rattle it down to the argument that causes the strongest emotional reaction and makes the most people scared.
Yeah.
And that's how it works. It's like the bully in the playground. You don't give the bully rights. You don't say, well, we'll give him this stick, he's only going to hit the crippled kids. No, you hit him with the stick, you kill him.
Unfortunately, the government's given all of the rights.
Yeah, they were put in power to a great extent by people like Murdoch. Murdoch hates us.
And the Coronavirus Act.
Knowing what you know now, would you have gone to that whiplash night again?
I never again saw the lady I was on a promise with. That was the other thing. I took the police to court.
Okay.
Sorry, in all of them, I forgot, because my stall got confiscated as evidence.
Oh,
So did Dave of Birmingham's, and all the dungeon equipment, what me and my mate Paul made. They nicked it, and I had to take the cops to court. It was Lavender Hill Magistrates Court. It, this was. Are we still recording?
Yeah.
Oh, thank God for that. Right. I'd lost the thread completely. The point was that after we got the not guilty in 1996, by which time most people got bored of it and they went, "Oh, that's going to the gate." I phoned up Madden and said, "Hello, you've got my kit." He said, "Who are you?" I said, "Look, there's my name." "Oh, we don't know who you." "Look," they would say, "Well, if you want to get your stuff back, you'll have to sue us." Okay. If that's the way, if you say so. So I did. And I applied to Lavender Hill Magistrates Court, and I had to get. I work in the theatre by profession, so getting up at 8:30 in the morning to travel on commuter train was like one of the lower reaches of hell. Do people do this for a living? And turning up at Lavender Hill, I had to turn up 3 times down there just to sue the police to get all this kit back. The kit that was mine actually wasn't worth that much money. It was crap, really. But there was the dungeon equipment, and there was Dave's store, and there was this. They're not having it.
Yeah.
Look at that. So yes, I think I got it back about 1998. It took a while, but the mills of God turn slowly, but they grind very fine. I think by then Madden might even have retired. I think that's the end of the story.
Any more questions? If we can just put our hands together and thank you for that.